Hey guys, welcome to Strictly Arcademic, the video series on my channel in which I deal in a more focused, intensive way with a game or a series of games, an issue in gaming culture, or something to do with perhaps game design or the nature of video games as an artistic medium, and subjected to the kind of philosophical and literary analysis that I am a student in, and that you guys will probably be more familiar with from my Let's Analyze videos. So this time we're going to talk about Watch Dogs and what it has to tell us, or to teach us rather, about the importance of media representation. Now, the structure of the essay that I've written is actually pretty heavily loaded towards answering objections. That's what I do for at least the first half of it, is just answer prospective objections. It's not actually until a significant amount in that I actually talk about Watch Dogs, the video game. There's a lot of groundwork that I have to set up before I can get to Watch Dogs. So if you just want to hear about what I think of Watch Dogs, I'll provide a little an annotation that you can use to skip to that. But in doing so, you'd be missing out on all the stuff that makes my discussion of Watch Dogs make sense. But if you only want to hear about that, I'll give you the option anyway. You can consume my materials however you like, and whatever you like is cool. Anyway, on to the essay. So, Aiden Pierce is an image personification of the concept of the action video game protagonist. Although the function of an action protagonist does not call for any specific quality set, if one attempted to infer the content of that notion from examining the protagonists of action-adventure video games, one would likely produce the spitting image of Mr. Pierce, a white, heterosexual cis male with short brown hair and a gravelly masculine voice. As with any generalization formed by surveying a decently large sample size, there will and do exist exceptions, but the hegemonic image of the action protagonist, that which holds a position of cultural dominance through overrepresentation and existing as reflections of those who most frequently hold positions of socio-political power, for instance, is one which resembles Aiden Pierce to a T. Well, what relevance does that have to do with anything ever, you may ask? I'd answer, a quirk of capitalism is that, oftentimes, characters and media produced within it are crafted to serve as representations of consumer bases, whether they are actually possessed by those who are crafting the media or pursued as an ideal. For instance, the increase in the amount of pop hits in the 2000s with rap verses as a result of the mostly white, middle-aged executives attempting to persuade the spending habits of an off-sided urban demographic to gravitate in their direction. A consequence of this, say those who sense that an argument for diverse media representation is floating on the winds, and who wish to counter by playing devil's advocate, is that video games, a medium the market for which is overwhelmingly dominated by white, heterosexual cis males in their late teens to mid-30s, are consequently saturated by gruff, white cis dudes who embody the traditional values of masculinity: perseverance, aggression, fortitude, and emotional stoicism. The fact that, for instance, this image of the video game consumer is anachronistic, and that plenty of white heterosexual males, trans or cis alike, are alienated from the virtues of masculinity, I shall simply name and put aside for the moment, as to treat them with the time that they deserve would expand the length of this video to ridiculous proportions. Those objections to this infernal advocacy aside, then, there exists the key observation that their account of the market mechanism's effects on hegemonic media representation is merely descriptive, in a sense that in which it sums up the current state of affairs, whereas pleas for diversity in media are prescriptive, and thus transfer the source of our investment of interest in them from, say, sociology or economics, to the badlands between ethics and politics, considered in the post-Platonic way, as branches of philosophical inquiry which concern themselves with the questions how should one live, and how should the social economic bodies be organized respectively. As such, merely furnishing the ground for the current state of things by pointing a finger at the market system and declaring who done it does not contradict or render less cogent the notion that media diversity is a laudable goal and should be progressed toward. It may account for some of the resistance we encounter on the way, but it does not transform the goal into something undesirable or impossible. This point recognized, our chummo Lucifer may insist. Fair enough, but there's no real urgency in arriving at that goal, right? I mean, it's not as if white, hetero-cis men existing as the ideal image of masculinity, and personhood more broadly, in the West is actively harming minorities, right? While it's important to recognize that someone who comes this far in the discussion is usually trying to grapple with unfamiliar concepts, often with good intentions, and in so doing may flail upon responses which may end up still being offensive, usually by accident, it's equally important to be blunt on this point. Yes, there is real urgency on this matter, because the hegemony of the white hetero-cis male as cultural ideal does harm those who do not conform to this image. Although this harm may not mark one's skin, its effects are profoundly real and negative. The harm is, to borrow a term from feminist scholar Judith Butler, ontological violence. What is ontological violence? Well, first let's define ontological. Ontology is a branch of the philosophical study of metaphysics, which concerns itself with existence in itself or as such, and so to do ontological violence to someone is to undermine the claim of one different from oneself to authentic existence, to categorize that person or class of people to an existential rung below that of the speaker, which of course involves setting up an ontological hierarchy on which different classes of people can be ranked, which in itself is part of the problem. To cite an example outside of the Holocaust, the most often cited one, the classification of Indigenous Australians as a class for whom it was necessary to devise special laws for governance until the 1967 alteration of the Australian Constitution is an example of legally sanctioned ontological violence. The fact that this amendment is often confused for the repeal of an act which mandated that Indigenous Australians were officially classified alongside wildlife explicates precisely the effect of ontological violence upon those to whom it's inflicted. It results in cultural and or legal dehumanization. Well, what has Aiden Pierce, the gravelly-voiced hacker out to avenge his fridged niece and sister, to do with this, you may ask? He's relevant insofar as he's the most recent instantiation of the abstract idea of an action video game protagonist. Like his chums Nathan Drake and Resident Evil 5's Chris Redfield, Aiden can be added to the growing list of action video game protagonists who exist as concrete instantiations of the archetypal image borrowed from action cinema. In particular, Aiden brings to mind the old philosophical debate as to whether abstract ideas referred to some hypothetical object, which borrows elements of all of its particular instantiations, or whether the appropriate referent is a particular concrete object, elevated through its generality to the function of representative for all objects in its class. So which is Aiden, general or particular? Bearing in mind that the referential pattern for one sort of abstract object must obtain for them all, this is in fact a binary choice, or none, it initially seems pretty tempting to opt for the general approach. After all, as I enumerated previously, Aiden's got the complete list of action video game protagonist necessary features. Add to this the fact that his motivation conjures one of the laziest tropes in the book, women in refrigerators, and one might be forgiven for thinking that Aiden is an expression of the essence of action heroism, a concrete object within which inheres all properties the thing needs to be an action video game protagonist. One might think this until one realizes that certain properties cannot coexist in the same object at the same time, and yet that the diversity of these properties is a reflection of the potential diversity of action video game protagonists. For instance, does Aiden have both brown and red hair simultaneously? Is Aiden both 180 centimeters tall and 160 centimeters tall simultaneously? There are numerous properties of object classes which, dispersed amongst their constituent units, increase the diversity of the whole. However, this very diversity entails that there can be no single image, which absolutely represents every object in that class. It may be objected that it's not the task of an abstract idea to contain every property expressed by every member of the class of which it's an abstraction. Rather, to abstract from a series of objects with both differing and shared properties is to divorce oneself from all that is particular, such that the abstraction represents only that which is essential to the class, in which inheres the collection of properties requisite to be a member of this class and not another one. This is another mode of saying that abstract ideas are Platonic forms, where the form for property F is F-ness itself, and not F. It's a bit awkward, but it's the definition of a Platonic form borrowed from the philosopher Alexander Nehamas. A lot of analytic philosophy in particular loves referring to things with kind of algebraic language, using letters as signs for things. Having thus reduced general abstract ideas from the threat of self-contradiction, the objection goes, their consistency is reintroduced at the cost of losing Aiden Pierce as an instantiation of the abstract idea of action heroism. I shall play a little game here, inspired by the philosopher David Hume as a response. Think of the idea of a chair. Not any particular chair you can see or have seen, mind. Think of a chair which is of no particular height, no particular colour, which has no particular seat. I think you'll find that you can't, and here's why. Hume argues in his book, A Treatise of Human Nature, that, quote, wherever objects are different are distinguishable, and whatever objects are distinguishable are separable by the thought and imagination, end quote. Naturally, reversing this proposition does not negate its validity, and this is demonstrated further by the impossibility of the contrary, begin quote again. For how is it possible that we can separate what is not distinguishable, or distinguish what is not different, end quote. When considering the notion of a line without any definite length, Hume wrote, beginning quote again, but 'tis evident at first sight that the precise length of a line is not different nor distinguishable from the line itself, nor the precise degree of any quality from the quality, end quote. What this entails is that there can be no such thing as an idea of an object without definite degrees in its qualities or established numbers in its quantities. This is why imagining a chair without envisioning a particular chair is impossible. We always imagine a chair of such and such a height, with such and such a seat, of such and such a colour, etc. Well, what happens when you replace an inanimate object like chair with human as the abstract idea to be considered? Just as in the formation of an abstract idea of a chair, to think of a human, or even a subclass of that set, like feudal guildmaster, or indeed action video game protagonist, as an abstract idea is, too implicit as it may be, form a precise notion of its qualities and quantities. Vitally, and much to the chagrin of reactionary folk who attempt to derail discussions of representations in media with the notion that race is irrelevant in the development of a character, this includes dimensions like race, sexuality, gender identity, and class. These are simply features that are essentially bound to the abstract idea of a human being, considered as belonging in a society developed beyond the discovery of agriculture, and as such are never irrelevant to the composition of a character. This isn't even considering the immense psychosocial importance that most of us place on these categories when considering ourselves. One typically cares far more about one's race or sexuality than one's preferred hand or one's height. Indeed, the race doesn't matter card is often played against those who suggest that media dominated by white, heterosexual, and cisgender male characters should afford more space for those who differ from this model, which, funnily enough, directly undermines the ground of the complaint. If race, gender, or sexuality, etc. are truly irrelevant to the composition of characters, then the speaker should have no problem with these elements being altered in established characters, or the creation of new characters who differ from white cishet maleness to broaden representation. The fact that the issuer of the X is irrelevant objection does oppose the alteration or creation of diverse characters, typically on some pathetic basis like not wanting media to bow to the PC police, or some other entitled bullshit, is a flagrant contradiction and an indication that X is irrelevant is simply code for leave my monopoly on representation in media alone, you social justice warriors. The fact that race, gender, etc. are buried within the essence of social humanity has a further implication. That when authors devise characters, their decisions concerning the concrete qualities to fill in these areas often convey implicit messages to those who care about representational diversity in media, or those who are affected by the aforementioned monopoly on representation, currently held by white cishet maleness. One implicit message that the existence of these monopoly indicates is that white cishet man is the default humanity relative to which women, people of colour, and those who are not cisgender or heterosexual as other, some kind of deviant mutation of normality. This consequence is expressed in the traditional use of the sign man or mankind to refer to humanity as a totality in pretty much all written works right up to the mid-20th century, when the movements concerned with social justice began to gather increasing support and an amplified voice. The practice still very much lingers to the present, but it's less universal than it was before this point. The othering of non-white, non-cis, and non-hetero folks is a form of ontological violence in the present day. To have white cis-hetness dominating our media is to implicitly suggest that the narratives of those who do not fit the model are somehow or other inferior, do not merit the effort or money required to render them with accuracy and consideration, and certainly not so much as to promote the works or direction of people of colour, particularly women of colour and non-cis folks. As Kayla Ancrum's article on MediaDiversified.org, How to Write Women of Colour and Men of Colour If You're White, states, many a time when white people attempt to include people of colour in their stories, a lack of research and or consultation with members of the culture depicted, laziness, or both, has resulted in images of people of colour which shock, horrify, and upset those who legitimately belong to the culture thus defamed, and anyone else with a functional empathetic instinct. The effects of such misrepresentation are not just inaccurate depiction, but rather the text that this depiction carries with it. Media like this confronts people of colour with the message, "This is what you are." And people of colour know that many other white folks, benign in intention but blind to what's going on due to unexamined white privilege, will take this misrepresentation on its face, and reproduce it in their own lives in conversations with other white folks and, disparagingly enough, with real people of colour. Once again, this is pure ontological violence, and the fact that the white authors may not be aware of how insulting or harmful this kind of thing is does not thereby absolve them of involvement. One not only has to recognise what's wrong, but endeavour to put one's energies in the service of rectifying it. The author of O Come All Ye White Saviours, also on Media Diversified, Fenderson Jelly Clark, and I'm sorry if I have mispronounced your name, has written about this phenomenon with a degree of eloquence and proximity to its effects that I can never possess, so I encourage all of you to read his work, which I shall link to in the description box. One particular segment, though, I feel I must reproduce here, as it's great import for my argument. With regard to the white saviour complex in film, Clark writes, in the case of film, particularly those produced through Hollywood, there are political and economic motives to securing both funding and distribution. You don't just walk up and say, "I have an idea for a film," and someone hands you a bag of money. Films often reflect what the industry believes will drive profits, what the industry believes the audience wants, and this in turn is all filtered through what many of those gatekeepers often groupthink themselves into believing people want to see. White saviours are on the top of the list. We keep on seeing them, because Hollywood believes that this is what the majority of moviegoers want to see. And who do they think of as the majority of moviegoers? White people. I'm talking to you again. Hollywood works on a built-in mechanism that says it has to please its large white moviegoing audience. In earlier days, this could mean cutting out a scene of black actor Bill Bojangles Robinson dancing up the stairs with a pre-adolescent Shirley Temple in The Little Colonel, because it might upset white male Sutherlands with weird psychosexual hang-ups. Whole entertainment scenes were sometimes filled with black actors who could be easily spliced out and left as disembodied singing voices, simply to conform to the varying regional sensibilities of white moviegoers. This trend, which keeps Hollywood's cast majority white with a few splashes of colour, generates white saviours, often to either give white audiences a reference point they're comfortable with, or to soothe white guilt when addressing a touchy subject. End quote. The rest of the article is also very much relevant, but we'll leave that citation as it is and encourage you to go read the rest of it. I suspect some viewers at this point may be frustrated at the title of the video, as I've barely even touched upon Watch Dogs itself. What the fuck has any of this to do with Watch Dogs, they may exclaim. The fact is, however, that Watch Dogs is simply not notable enough for what it is to have consumed more space among the necessary theoretical meat hitherto. Watch Dogs' primary interest, to me at least, is how the potential of the embryo of a premise, given form at E3 2012, was suffocated through reliance on lazy, derivative narrative and character design. What did we see at E3 2012? We saw a shadowy technomancer wielding a staggering degree of influence over his environment through his smartphone, using the tools at his disposal to navigate a problem without recourse to the standard modes of puzzle solving available in action-adventure games. Apply weapon to enemy. What we received in the finished game was a little girl simultaneously introduced and killed off to ignite the character arc of her uncle, without so much as a shot of her face, and no, the icon on the PC of the conspirator does not count, or a scene establishing the closeness of their relationship. Said uncle, simultaneously functioning as a crude cardboard facsimile of a human face for an audience to peer through, and a male Mary Sue to a degree approximating fucking Batman, then embarks on twin odysseys of revenge and vigilantism, which, funnily enough, are not even thematically or narratively connected. Indeed, the opening of the game implies that Pierce engages in vigilante justice as a form of releasing frustration.
I need to get my mind off things. Lucky for me, this city's full of distractions. And they can't hide from me.
His journey is shared by Clara Lil, a smouldering cyber pixie dream girl whose character can literally be reduced to 3 functions, as she has no character outside of these. 1. Aiding Aiden Pierce. 2. ensuring that any cutscene time in which she's present not devoted to dumping exposition is centered on her hinting at sexual attraction to Pierce, and, as is in Avatar for them, the audience by proxy, in one of the most transparent attempts at nerd baiting I've ever seen.
You done then?
You have what you need.
So far, yeah. Okay, look, I understand if you're scared.
I'm not scared. No one asked me to stay.
Well, no one asked you to leave.
You'll need to do better than that.
I could use some help. I could use your help.
Like a team.
Sure, like a team.
Not used to being a team.
No, I'm not.
Was that so hard?
No.
Let's go then.
Sure.
And 3, to be fridged in the final portion of the game's narrative for no purpose, accompanied by a manipulatively mournful piano piece, and given the purposelessness of her death and her dearth of actual character moments, this is frankly fucking insulting. There's also a white mentor figure with dreadlocks, who manages to survive the narrative presumably on account of his penis. So, par for the course then. As I said, I mourn for the game that could have emerged from the sliver displayed at E3 2012 had it had the fortune to land in more proficient hands. We could imagine a hacker who's a person of colour, not motivated by fridged women, but, say, discovering inside knowledge that, for instance, an election was rigged through the machinations of right-wing think tanks, or that a corporation hired paramilitaries to sabotage competition overseas, etc., etc. We could imagine that person's induction into hacking culture as something other than young white delinquent is veered away from the wrong side of the tracks by an older, wiser white man, for instance. They may have developed their talents through a desire to hit back at austerity programs which overwhelmingly targeted poor social strata, by stealing from those who made donations to those who implemented them, etc. Or, my leftist politico-pornographic fantasies aside, we could imagine someone being motivated by the allure of the image of the technomancer, aforementioned, caught in the development of their powers in the ethical quandaries in which extra-legal cyber-vigilantism offers up. In fact, for a game which explicitly deals with vigilantism, Watch Dogs does not, even once, engage in serious reflection on the ethics of what Aiden Pierce does. He occasionally, in his bounce with first-person narration, wonders to himself, maybe what I'm doing isn't the clearly morally preferable option, for a few seconds before just carrying on with it. He's never paralysed with doubt, never has an existential crisis, never alters his goals or behavioural patterns to react to a liquid situation, and is never stopped short by the thought that killing the one who ordered the hit may not even bring him peace. He just kills who he needs to, and steals what he has to accomplish his arbitrary goal of killing a 75-year-old man in the twilight of a successful criminal career, who literally forgot that Aiden existed. In response to successfully alienating his sister and nephew, in the name of the protection of whom he has killed legions of rank-and-file criminals, to the degree that they skip town immediately after being rescued by him, Aiden immediately spins right around and goes back to inching his way closer to Lucky Quinn through the blood of his fellow men. There's not even a shade of a character here. In summary, Watch Dogs could have been so much more than it is at present. A nifty and fun to play with spin on an open-world navigation smothered by a deleterious mass of dead text, had it stopped invoking the abstract ideas of action video game protagonist and action conspiracy narrative, filling the qualitative and quantitative slots of its characters, setting, and plot with interesting human content. To compound the disappointment of a premise withered to emaciation by marketing departments and lazy designers, the game's refusal to include a woman or person of colour with agency, character, and humanity, and to give them a substantial presence, thus negating Geordie Chin, who himself is another lazy archetype, that of the wacky comic relief character engaging in dark subject matter, contributes to a culture in which non-whiteness, non-cisness, non-heterosexuality, and non-maleness is to be deviant, other, and thus less deserving of having their stories told. One of the reasons games criticism has begun to address the issues of race, gender, and sexuality is, alongside simply doing the right thing by challenging bigotry where it lives, be it unconscious or not, to ensure that games like Watch Dogs don't happen, to direct the eyes of our culture towards avenues of expression and concepts which, operating under the hegemony we do, renders much less visible. I mean, also, as a final thought, I can't believe there's no blind fire function in a third-person open-world game. Really, guys? Really? Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed what you've heard thus far. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you again very shortly.